about, given the fossil fuels, let's talk about that as well. They account for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and with the scientific consensus indicating that emissions must be halved by 2030 to avert the worst effects of climate change, what specific policy measures do you believe governments, especially in the Gulf, who are so reliant on such fuels, prioritize plans to move away from these natural resources?
Well, to start with, let me mention that with the date 1850, which is pretty much the date we consider the Industrial Revolution, the average global temperature was 14 degrees. Today is 15.2. We are talking about the average temperature across all the globe and across all the seasons. While UN pushes to keep temperatures below 16 degrees, which is what we call, in easier terms, the +2 degrees scenario. Moreover, the UN and Paris Agreement and all the various external stakeholders are trying to push and convey the effort toward the 2050 so-called net zero, which means that there is no emission, or whatever emission is there has been balanced by planting trees or carbon capturing and so on. Now, having said that, what is the positioning of the countries, and specifically I can talk about the Gulf countries. Well, I would start by saying that it's fundamental to acknowledge that Gulf countries must be considered as a special case, because Gulf country economies rely mainly on the export of energy. So it's easier, for example, for Norway or for Denmark or for Italy or for Switzerland to talk about net zero. Is a little bit more complicated for the GCC countries. However, in order to consider a transition to the green economy, I would consider fundamental aspects of the policies that should be taken into account. First of all, reaching a diversification of energy sources. So investing into solar, wind, geothermal, and other sources of energies, possibly also the nuclear. And recently UAE has announced the launch, is already operating a nuclear facility plant. And I would also consider, apart from that, programs of development for biofuels, green hydrogen, carbon capturing, flare reduction for the oil in particular. Apart from that, it's important to understand that the regulatory and financial incentives for renewables are a core aspect of this whole transition, because governments should offer subsidies, tax incentives, and other financial instruments for businesses, for people, for households in general, to install their PV systems and create that decentralized mechanism where the country basically handle the domestic need for the critical national infrastructure, while at the same time people just generate energy for their own private use. That scenario would be perfect. And the only way to initiate that process is to provide incentives and financial helps. I would also consider the further development of green technologies. This involves into more research and development, collaboration with the private and public sector, national and international bodies, and gradually make this effort, internal effort, which can be also conveyed by establishing carbon pricing mechanisms. And here I would like to mention two things very quickly. So the first one is that by 2026 in Europe will be official the launch of the ETS and the CBAM, so the carbon taxes, which will be applied to all the imports in Europe coming from extra-European countries, for example, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. Now, this has a huge impact on the export of the GCC countries, like I mentioned. It's not only a matter of reaching the domestic supply, but it's also a matter of understanding how to keep exporting and maintaining a leading positioning in the market when it comes to the market share. So I believe two things can be done here. One, internally can be developed a cap and trade mechanism, the so-called mandatory market, through carbon allowances. And the second one is to push the adoption of the private sector and people, is to develop an ad hoc voluntary markets made of carbon credits. This can be true on a primary market for entities, businesses, and large corporation or investment firms, but also for, let's say, intra-citizens transactions, which would be allowed on a secondary market and enabled by asset tokenization. So essentially leveraging emerging technologies like AI and blockchain and every DLT system. I believe that's the way to go, alongside a piloting and testing, but realistically, I'm a little bit skeptical on achieving the net zero by 2050 on global scale.